This home theater PC from 2012 has been sitting in my dad's home theater rack, collecting dust for the past 3 years, with a dead power supply and a copy of Paired Linux that won't boot. But after some interest in modern multiplayer titles such as Overwatch and Rocket League, I thought that the perfect Christmas gift may indeed exist. This is Cloud Factory Senior. The first step was to clean out the dust that could wishfully be described as asthma-inducing. So, after airing out the room, talking to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, and taking off my hazmat suit, I was able to continue with the disassembly process so that I could completely clean out the case as well as install a new power supply. And clean I did, quite successfully on my dad, and after jumping through a few hoops that come with the 10-year-old case, and taking out the DVD drive and the 3.5-inch floppy drive, I was able to vacuum out most of the dust inside, employing a damp cloth for the rest. However, although the dust was a nuisance, it was not the problem at the heart of the computer. That instead would be the Antec 400-watt power supply that came bundled with the original case. Okay for the original hardware of the PC, but not if any upgrades were in store. So, out with the old and in with the new, upgrading to an EVGA 450B, which has perfectly okay efficiency of 80 plus bronze, as well as enough power to reliably fit an upgrade in hardware. Speaking of hardware, without any additions, this PC started out rocking an 8-core AMD FX 8150 clocked at its default speed of 3.6 GHz. This was paired by a 2x4GB DDR3 DIMM pack of AMD Performance RAM, with a gigabyte-made Radeon HD 6670 with 1GB of DDR3 VRAM as the GPU. For storage, it had 128GB OCZ SSD, and this was all paired together on the Asus M5A97 Revision 2.0 motherboard. Honestly, pretty decent specs for 2012, but not for 2018. But before I could boot anything up, I needed to address the other pair in the room, Linux. And to make matters worse, Linux that wouldn't boot. Which only left one true option if gaming was going to be an option on this computer, and that was obviously Mac. Which only left one true option if gaming was going to be an option on this computer, and that was obviously Windows. So after wiping the SSD of Linux and spamming the next button to install Windows, I was finally able to run some preliminary benchmarks. Before I installed any new hardware, the computer ended up getting a score of 203 in Unigine Heaven on the Ultra preset, with an average of 8.1 FPS, with in 3D Mark Firestrike scoring an overall of 1004 with a GPU score of 1041. In Rocket League, maxed out at 720p, the PC was able to put out 38 frames per second on average, but when turned down to low, that number was able to shoot up all the way to 90 FPS. And finally, in Overwatch, on lowest settings at 720p, it averaged 45 FPS, and with all the settings on max, granted a completely unplayable frame rate of 14 FPS. Meaning that with a CPU score of 6640 in Firestrike, with the goal of 720p gaming, the CPU and RAM really weren't the issue. Especially when factoring in the current RAM prices, meaning that a simple GPU upgrade should be all that was needed. Luckily, there has been no better time for lower-end graphics cards, so after picking up a factory overclocked GTX 1050 from MSI, we were off to the races. Once booted into Windows with all the new drivers installed, it was time to see the upgrade. In Unigine Heaven on the Ultra preset again, the GTX 1050 upgraded the score all the way to 1449, with an average of 57.5 FPS, an almost 7 times improvement in performance. Also mirrored in Firestrike with a total score of 5938 and the GPU scoring 7134. In Rocket League on the lowest setting, it scored an average of 210 FPS, and when maxed out, the number only dropped to 145 FPS. With finally, on Overwatch on the lowest possible settings, outputting 150 FPS on average, and when maxed out, still granting a far beyond playable 110 FPS average, all at 720p. Which, when putting all these numbers together and comparing them to the old benchmarks, granted an over 500% average improvement, a staggeringly huge increase. But because we didn't upgrade the CPU, how is the CPU holding up? Although the FX 8150 is marketed as an 8-core and technically does have those 8 cores, it's really only a 4-core CPU with hyper-threading. And with the notoriously low instructions per clock of Bulldozer, the architecture the CPU is created from. However, while gaming, the CPU is not an issue. So with the new operating system, graphics card, and power supply put in, it was time to wrap up all the parts that I didn't need and put them into a nice little Christmas box to deliver them on Christmas Day. Which leaves us with Cloud Factory Senior, the older, more gentle member to the Cloud Factory family, who may not be as fast and shiny as its namesake, but most certainly holds its own in a perfectly adequate way for the task it is set out to do, leaving it to stand guard in its home theater rack, awaiting its inevitable call to arms. So, Merry Christmas, Dad, even though it's 2018 now. Sorry.